Homeschool, a novel by Casey Giltner. Chapter 8. Lamb for the Slaughter. The collision rocked them. The car swerved, the wheels clutched for solid road, fishtailing and skidding to an eventual stop on the opposite gravel embankment. Vivian was shaking. Her knuckles were white, hands gripped tight to the wheel. "Mira, are you okay?" She was doing her best to keep her voice steady, but she was clearly rattled. Mira didn't answer. She was frozen, pressed back in her seat. Fresh shock had her paralyzed. How was this happening again? And so soon after what happened to her and her mother? Why her? Did the universe have it out for her? The creature. The realization unfroze her. Her hand searched for the door handle. "Mira, stay in the car. We shouldn't go out there." But Mira was already walking around to the front of the car. The fender was nearly broken in two. The hood was dented and bloody. One side mirror hung by a tether. The windshield glass was splintered right down the middle, but miraculously hadn't shattered. Either the car was too vintage to have airbags, or they'd failed to trigger. Thankfully, they'd both been wearing their seatbelts. She traced the blood back up the road to the ditch, where she found the thing they had hit. It was a lamb. It was struggling to breathe, insides torn open and exposed, its pure whiteness spoiled and split with a deep crimson red. Mira's eyes widened in horror. She watched the spastic rise and fall of the lamb's chest. Blood pooled in its guts, bubbling with each attempted breath. The lamb tried to lift its head. It tried to call out, but all it could do was suffer. "It needs to be put out of its misery." Mira took a tentative step forward to do just that, but Vivian appeared at her shoulder. "Come back to the car." "Shouldn't we do something?" "There's nothing we can do." "We could... I don't know, we should do something," Mira stammered. How could they just leave it there, suffering like that? "It's with God now," Vivian said. She guided Mira, somewhat forcibly, back toward the car, leaving the lamb to wheeze its final breaths in the utmost pain. Chapter 9. Processing. Vivian's knife slid through the steak, bleeding out across the plate, soaking into the potatoes and tinting them red. Mira's traumatized eyes stared at Vivian's food. Her own utensils remained untouched next to her plate, on which a single baked potato sat, equally untouched. "Interesting choice," her aunt commented between bites. "You said I had to eat something." The diner was greasy, from the food to the clientele to the very air itself. It was near midnight, and they had been lucky to find something open on this barren stretch of Nebraska. Jet's 24-hour pit stop diner was as fine of an oasis to process recent events as they were going to get. "When's the last time you had meat?" "I don't know, when I was like 6. "That's very forward-thinking of you." "Just makes sense." "How so?" "For the environment, ethically, every way." "You have a strong sense of right and wrong for someone your age." Vivian smiled approvingly. Mira shrugged. She hadn't really thought about it that deeply. But her aunt seemed to take it as a sign of some part of a better nature. "Have you been in a car accident before?" Mira asked. Vivian finished chewing before answering. No. No, I haven't. Just a little fender bender." She seemed rattled. She took another bite and changed the subject. "Did your mom ever tell you why you moved to Colorado?" Mira shook her head. Her mother had rarely spoken of her Wisconsin days, or her family for that matter, and Mira had only marginally cared to ask. In the few words she had devoted to the subject, Mira had learned her mother had needed a fresh start in a new place where the air was clean and the faces were friendly. Though she didn't know specifics, she knew intuitively that Wisconsin had been small and suffocating for her mother, and however it had ended, it hadn't been on good terms. "She was so headstrong," Vivian said nostalgically. "There was no telling her what to do or how to do it. I bet the apple didn't fall far from that particular tree." Mira smirked, pleased by the thought of their similarity. She picked up her fork and knife and cut into her potato. But before the fork could deliver the first bite to her mouth, her face cratered. Even a happy thought of her mother brought forth a wave of emotion along with it, depression cascading through after. Why was it so hard just to not think about her, to tune out the trauma and put the past behind her? "What are you thinking about?" Vivian asked politely, having clocked the sudden shift in Mira's disposition. "Nothing."
"You know, I'm told I'm a very good listener."
Mira said nothing. She had never been a big sharer. Her mother could always intuit what Mira was thinking and feeling and coax it out of her. The last thing she felt like doing was talking, spilling her guts, revealing herself. Even that bleeding steak seemed a more appealing proposition. And while she might have been family, Vivian was, for all intents and purposes, a near total stranger. Vivian neatly set down her silverware and looked Mira dead in the face. In my congregation, my church, we have a method for unburdening yourself, a way to feel better, a sort of therapy. Therapy? Mira spat, not bothering to hide her contempt. But her aunt was nonplussed. You sit and confess what's bothering you, and when you leave, you have less burdening you than when you sat down. Why would I confess? I didn't do anything wrong. Life isn't just about what we did, it's about what we didn't do, Vivian explained. Or could have done differently, ways we wish we had acted, things we regret. It will help, I promise. Vivian's words hit her hard. Regret, chief among them. Mira stewed for a moment, unsure how to escape her despair, before simply yielding to her aunt's offer with a nod. You'll do it? I'll try, Mira muttered. Vivian smiled, careful not to look too pleased with herself. She set herself straight and rigid, hands flat on the table, and indicated for Mira to match her. Straighten up. Mira set her fork down and sat up a bit. Hands flat on the table. Why? It's all a part of the process. With great effort, Mira dragged her hands up to the table. Look at me. Only me. Mira looked at her aunt straight on and tried to narrow out the diner around them. It's just us. Just you and me. Nobody else. Block out everything except for my voice. Only my voice. Nothing else. Feeling quite stupid, Mira focused on her aunt's face. On the creases on her strained forehead. On the slight curve in her nose. On her narrow, refined cheeks. On her mouth. On her thin lips that cracked like clay when she spoke. Slowly at first, but then all at once, Mira felt unbound, locked in and zoning out the world around them. How are you feeling in this moment? Just a word. Many answers came to mind. She eventually landed on tired. Vivian gave her an understanding smile. Do you feel helpless? Mira didn't quite nod, but she didn't shake her head either. An admission by omission. Alone? Confused? Depressed? To each word, she gave the same non-reaction. Guilty? Again, Mira didn't answer, but the mist in her eyes betrayed her. Why do you feel guilty? I don't know. Is there anything you regret? Mira shifted uncomfortably, burying her eyes in her lap. Stay with me. Mira lifted her eyes and re-engaged. What is it you regret? I don't know. A glass shattered across the diner. Mira jumped and looked away. The diner, noise and all, returned with a sudden vengeance. Eyes here, just the sound of my voice, nothing else. Mira blinked, refocusing on Vivian. The world around her narrowed. The sound dropped out again. Do you blame yourself for your mother's death? Mira felt the tears begin to well up. The answer, obviously, was yes, but the word wouldn't make it to her lips. Vivian pressed her. Why? I distracted her. Vivian studied her closely, tracking every twitch of emotion. Do you think you could have saved her? Yes, Mira relented. Do you wish you had died instead? Mira reacted sharply. What? What an absurd question. No, of course she wouldn't rather be dead. But only the subconscious truth escaped her mouth. I don't know. Vivian reached across the table. She pushed the untouched potato out of the way and took Mira's hand in hers. Guilt can be very powerful and dangerous, but you have nothing to feel guilty about. It was just her time, and there was nothing you could have done to change that. Mira's wet eyes lifted up to meet Vivian's piercing gaze. Do you mind if I pray? Not waiting for Mira's response, Vivian tapped her heart twice and bowed her head. Mira blinked the tears away. All at once, the diner came rushing back to her. The clatter of silverware, the cash register, the smell of deep fryers, and the idle chatter of other patrons. Someone across the diner glared at them, at Vivian's feverish prayer. All of it was so benign, the tedious, everyday, ordinary, and daily petty judgments. How distant it all seemed now. How impossibly beyond her grasp. How fucking pointless. Nothing will ever be the
same.
Later, as Vivian smoked her cigarette in the car with her window slightly cracked, and as Mira gazed out at the passing farmland, she had to admit to herself she did feel lighter, slightly less burdened. Mira didn't have much experience with religion and didn't desire any. Her aunt was obviously an exceptionally devout person. Mira hoped she wouldn't be forced to participate. She wondered what organized religion was like. If it was anything like that experience in the diner, well, she could bear it, she supposed, if she had to. Chapter 10. New Hope. New Hope. That was the name of the town. It was a post-war, working-class municipality. The houses were all 75 years old, in varying shades of browns and yellows, cozy like a snow globe village. It was a factory town, but the plant the town had been built for, designed for, and existed for was long closed. The people, though, were still here. Somehow, they'd found a way, finding a path to preserve, and a generation or two later, New Hope somehow felt on the upswing again. And yet, to Mira, the whole thing felt so damn quaint, so insular, so inescapable. New Hope. It should feel ironic. It mostly just made her want to puke. She took in the sights as they drove. The town had essentially just one of everything. One high school, one grocery store, one Walmart, one bakery, one high-end Italian restaurant, one gym, one laundromat, one used car lot, and, to Mira's great relief, one park with a concrete skate park. A BMX bike was currently tearing up the half pipe while a smattering of teens loitered nearby. A church bell rang in the distance. It grew louder as they drove. It stopped when they did. "We're here." Mira stayed in the car and looked up for the source of the bells. A chapel. It may have been the oldest thing in the entire town. Or, more likely, the second thing built after the plant. A century at least. It had obviously fallen into disrepair. The windows were all boarded up. Moss and ivy had run wild, seizing nearly all of the northern side and threatening to expand their gains. Since she seemed unlikely to do so herself, Vivian opened Mira's door for her. "This is it." Mira's stomach dropped. "You live in a church?" "Don't be silly. Come on." Mira dragged herself out. Vivian led her along the cobblestone walkway, back around the chapel, many of its bricks crumbling on closer examination, to reveal a smaller house on the other side. "This used to be the rectory, but the parish doesn't use it anymore." It was made of rigid brown brick and spotted with stained glass windows. It was utilitarian for a prior era, built for function, not comfort. There was nothing warm about it. As they approached, Mira could hear a bubbling noise. There was something happening inside the house. Shadows flit behind the stained glass, disfigured and made Picasso-esque by the fragmented glass. They opened the door and were met by screams. Chapter 11. The Congregation. Mira braced herself. There was an uproar. A dozen hands jutted out at her. She managed to dodge them, but they got a hold of Vivian, yanking her inside. It took her a moment to realize the uproar was not of anger, but of joy. They swept Vivian inside, all disappearing within. Mira peeked her head inside as the yells subsided. It was pure commotion. Over a dozen people were running around the main floor, preparing for what looked like a dinner party. They were greeting Vivian like a returning hero, back after a trip of great torment, a rolling cascade of jubilation. They were a proper church-going, God-fearing group, the type that wore their Sunday best all 7 days of the week. On top of that, they were old. 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s all represented. Vivian might have been the youngest, and it was clear they loved her, maybe even revered her. Mira felt like an alien in their midst. She was a different breed, a different species entirely. A belated silence descended on the room as all those proper eyes, two at a time, now caught sight of Mira, gazing in from beyond the threshold. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" a strange man teased, lips curled. Vivian, from the middle of the pack, beckoned Mira inside. "Don't be shy." Mira stepped into the house, revealing herself fully. For a moment, it seemed everyone in the room was holding their breath, Mira included. Vivian's cheeks flushed with pride. "Everyone, this is Mira. Mira, this is, well, everyone." A dozen indecipherable faces beamed back at her expectantly. "Hi." Firmly ensconced within the commotion of the house, Mira turned her eyes to the interior of the residence. It was stuffy, furnished sparingly, and the sheer amount of stained glass made it severely lacking in natural light. Awash in muted tones of brown and gray, austere and harsh. Despite the warmth between the people there, it made her shiver. The entryway opened on a long hallway and a number of closed wooden doors. On her immediate left was the sitting room, which led to an elongated dining room and eventually gave way to the kitchen. On the right, a staircase snaked up the edge of the house to the second floor. Mira had no time to examine the finer details of the house. She was already being steered by the crowd into the dining room, directly to the head of a long, ornate, oak dining table that was dressed and set for a family-style dinner. The table quickly filled in around her. Conversations were flying throughout the room. A late middle-aged couple slid into the immediate seats on her left. Their outfits seemed planned to match, roughly hewn plaid suits of scratchy-looking wool with high necks for their obviously high morals. Mira doubted whether they ever left each other's side. They nodded at her simultaneously, each more excited than the other, and eagerly reached across the table to shake her hand. "Hello," said the woman. "How are you?" asked the man. "We're the Rutherfords, the Mr. and Mrs. It's a pleasure to meet you. A real pleasure, Mira. We're so happy you made it here safely. How are the roads? The drive okay? Not too much construction?" Mira waited before answering, unsure whether it was her turn to speak. "It was okay." "Your aunt take good care of you?" The pair picked right back up. "She's a careful driver, extremely studious, great attention to detail. She's a real treasure. A gem. Bellissima." A new voice, an extremely Italian one. On her right, an old woman was staring at her adoringly. "This is Mrs. Mastroianni." Mrs. Rutherford chimed right back in, answering the question before Mira could ask it. Mrs. Mastroianni had to be at least 80. She had a thick Italian accent and even thicker layers of makeup globbed around her unblinking eyes. She had been glamorous once. That instinct was still there, desperate to be regarded. She positively beamed at Mira. "I live just across the street. How are you, dear?" "I'm good, thanks." Mrs. Mastroianni smiled wondrously at Mira, seemingly without intent to converse further, only to hold her gaze. Mira struggled to break the spell. You all go to the same church?" "You might say the people in this room run the church," Mr. Rutherford said with a nervous chuckle. "Wouldn't be much of a church without us, especially your aunt," preached Mrs. Rutherford. "You can say that again," chuckled Mr. Rutherford. "Wouldn't be much of a church without us," Mrs. Rutherford repeated coyly. "Oh!" Mr. Rutherford gasped, his nervous chuckling running away with itself. Not a moment too soon, Vivian appeared, taking the empty seat on Mira's immediate right. "I'm so sorry, honey. I told them not to prepare all this, but they just couldn't resist." New congregants began to flow from the kitchen, carrying forth food for the table. Another appeared from over Mira's shoulder and began pouring blood-red wine into each wine glass, including, to Mira's surprise, her own. Before she could question it, Vivian lifted her glass and held it toward Mira. Mira lifted her glass uncertainly and touched them together, creating a light clink. Vivian turned and did the same with Mrs. Mastroianni, who clinked hers with the person next to her, and so on, until the chain reached the opposite end, to a man in a clerical collar, studying Mira from afar. In all the commotion, Mira hadn't noticed him, but now that she had, he was incapable of ignoring. He was 70-something and had the feel of a statesman. There was something inescapably cunning about him. He had a smile that both enticed and deceived at the same time. He wore a tight-buttoned brown shirt, not black like a Catholic priest. A modified crucifix emblem hung from his neck. Unnerved, Mira looked away and took a tepid taste of the wine, expecting grape juice. It was dry and left her mouth parched. Though she had never tasted wine before, she knew it was the real deal. She didn't much like it. When she could no longer reasonably be pretending to drink, she dared to glance up again. Her eyes found their way back to the man in the clerical collar. He was still watching her. He smiled and gave Mira a slight bow of his head as he raised his glass. "That's the deacon, Deacon Sandy," Vivian interjected, having spied the interaction. As if on cue, the deacon stood. The room went quiet, all eyes affixed on the deacon. He raised his right hand, his 4 fingers held together, and tapped twice over his heart. To Mira's great surprise, everyone did the gesture in return. Tap, tap. The deacon spread his hands and spoke loudly, as though addressing a much larger body of people than just those at the table. "Welcome, everyone. To those we have known, and to those we are yet to truly meet, he gestured to Mira. I trust there won't be any sermons tonight, Deacon, Vivian interrupted. The table laughed. Mira couldn't think why. Vivian seemed quite serious. The deacon waved a dismissive hand. Wouldn't dream of it, Vivian. I would, however, like us to pray, if you will indulge me. He took the hands of those on either side of him and tipped his head. The rest of the congregants followed suit. Vivian gave Mira a conspiratorial little glance and took one of her hands. Mrs. Rutherford eagerly snatched the other. Everyone closed their eyes and bowed their heads in prayer. Everyone except for Mira. In these dark times, it is with great humility that we welcome a beacon of light, a note of grace, into our lives. We pray for Mira. We pray for her mother. We pray for your humble servants in this room. And of course, we ask you to bless this feast, this food, and this drink. Amen. Amen. With great ceremony, the deacon raised his wine to toast. The room copied the gesture. And now, let us eat and drink to your good health, Mira, and to the grace of God and his good works. May his prophecy be fulfilled. We will share in the fruits of his works. The table had boomed back at him. The group response startled Mira. But quickly, everyone was clinking glasses, drinking, and serving themselves food as though nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. A dish arrived into Mira's hands. Roasted chicken. She passed it along without taking anything. Another was hot on its tail, this one bacon-wrapped shrimp. Then another. She continued to pass the plates, eventually settling for a dinner roll. Though everyone was looking at her, no one seemed concerned by her lack of appetite. Out of sheer nervousness, she took another sip of the wine. It tasted slightly less awful. She felt her cheeks flush in a pleasant way. The mood around her was celebratory. Happy faces smiled at her from every direction. But Mira was overwhelmed. This was all too much. The room felt smaller every minute, like the walls were beginning to close in on her. Chapter 12. Harmless Musings. Mira was fading fast. The dinner party had adjourned to the sitting room. All around her were people in conversation, but she heard none of them. Random words and phrases washed over her like waves, in and out of comprehension. She felt lightheaded. How many glasses of wine had she drunk? She couldn't be sure. Every time she had made a dent, someone had appeared to fill it back to the top. She stared into the large fireplace. The flames danced invitingly. The heat blushed her already warmed face and lulled her toward sleep like an old friend. Shapes and images appeared as though her dreams were threatening to spill into the physical world. She sensed a new presence nearby. Her unconscious mind faded from view, and she saw the deacon at her side. He met her glare with a grin. See anything interesting in there? His face was smooth, almost too smooth. His features manicured and pruned. It was obvious he cared about, and for, his image greatly. He had a habit of holding his breath after a question that invited an answer. Perhaps it was the wine slowing her thoughts, but Mira didn't take the bait. The Lord sends visions and messages, often when we least expect them. God is always speaking to us. It's just a matter of whether we're ready to listen. He edged himself closer, but before he could elaborate, Vivian had appeared at his elbow with a bottle of wine. She filled the deacon's glass. I thought I warned you about your sermons, Deacon. Deacon Sandy held up an innocent hand. Only harmless musings, Vivian, I assure you. He isn't boring you, is he? He just can't help himself, can he? Vivian went to fill Mira's glass, but she withheld it. An urge of longing, a deep desire to be solely and fully alone pervaded through the warm haze of fire and wine. I think I need to go to bed. More than a few heads turned their way. But you've only just arrived, said Deacon Sandy. I'm exhausted. Sorry. Her usual aversion to being impolite was fading fast. She just wanted to be alone. But unlike the deacon, Vivian was more than understanding. Of course. I wasn't thinking. You need your rest. Mira nodded, a polite but dizzy goodbye to the others. Vivian led Mira to the stairs. Deacon Sandy gave a slight parting bow, holding her gaze until she walked out of sight. I'm sorry. I'm just really tired. Vivian waved away her concerns. You don't need to make excuses with me, Mira. I'm an open book, and I want you to be the same. You can tell me anything. She gave Mira a deep hug. Mira felt some of her rigidness relax. Maybe it was the wine. Mira stumbled into the room and collapsed face down on the bed, emotionally and physically spent. She took no time or effort to make note of her surroundings. She tugged at the chain around her neck, pulling out her mother's necklace. She gazed deeply into the facets of the crystal. Ruby red abstracts danced on her face. Down below, the party had grown quiet. Perhaps some had left. Perhaps they were praying. Mira's thoughts wandered in the silence. Chapter 13. The First Night. Mira was unable to sleep. Whether it was the new surroundings, the way the house had suddenly gone quiet, the water damage on the ceiling, or the tormented face of Jesus on the massive crucifix above her, try as she might, sleep didn't seem in the cards. Every time her eyes did manage to flicker shut, she saw a pair of blinding headlights. Each time her mind drifted toward slumber, she heard her mother's screams and the earth-shattering collision. And even though it was only momentary, she would find herself drenched in sweat, shaking, the scream still echoing in her ears. No, sleep was definitely not in the cards. She sat up and, with nothing better to do, took stock of the inside of her room. The ceiling was low and at an angle, an optical illusion that threw you off balance and gave one the impression the roof was collapsing in on itself at all times. There was not much in the way of decor, but on the wall above her bed was a 4-foot-long crucifix, complete with a crown of thorns and painted-on blood wounds. Jesus was draped only in a loincloth, and his bare body was oddly muscular. In fact, Mira thought there might have been a few non-existent muscles dreamed up for good measure. The 4-poster bed, sans drapes, was older than the house and creaked with even the subtlest of movements, rippling to the hardwood floorboards which ebbed and groaned in their own right. It gave the impression that to even breathe was to alert the whole house to her presence. She stood and padded to the door, but quickly abandoned the pretense of subterfuge, so loud was each step, and flattened her heels. She stood at the stair's edge. The house was dark down below. At some point, the party had ended and the guests had left. Somehow, Mira hadn't heard them leave. It was quiet. The house seemed to breathe up at her, inviting her to descend. She took the plunge and proceeded cautiously down the wooden staircase into the dark abyss below. Each creaking step echoed out into the house. She held at the threshold to the living room, feeling a presence, as though the room was occupied a moment earlier. She heard a foreign sound from somewhere deep in the house, a low, whining noise repeating every few seconds before fading away. She veered away from it and eased into the living room, taking the time to examine the decor up close. The house was filled with religious iconography, of course, but it all seemed slightly modified, at least as Mira understood it. Everywhere she looked, there was a crucifix, but each of them was boxed in at the points into a diamond. She lingered on one particular framed painting of the diamond crucifix. The points of the diamond were colored in bright red. It occurred to her it was exactly like the one hanging over her bed. She hadn't initially noticed the unique aspects, though now they seemed obvious. Another thought occurred. It was exactly like the emblem that hung from the deacon's neck that very evening. The noise returned. She eased across the quaking floorboards, tracing the noise down the hallway to a closed door. Mira put her ear against the door. The whining noise leaked through. She tried the doorknob, but it was firmly locked. She dropped to her knees and put her eye to the brass keyhole. It was her aunt's bedroom, a Spartan, puritanically stripped residence dominated by her own antique 4-poster bed. Unlike Mira's bed, there were curtains, but they were not fully drawn. Mira could spy Vivian in bed. The source of the whining noise was an ancient-looking CPAP machine. She spotted it on a bedside table in the corner, churning mechanically, matching the rise and fall of her aunt's body. She seemed asleep, and yet she was moving. The sleep apnea mask had slipped off Vivian's face. Her eyes were open, rolled back in her head. Her back was contorted dangerously, alternating between deep grunts and high-pitched whines, as though communicating with some invisible presence, having something between a nightmare and a seizure. Mira pressed her eye tight against the keyhole. What the hell was she looking at? A massive noise sounded behind her, making Mira jump back.
She looked at the front door, just in time for another.
Now that she was prepared for it, she realized it was the chapel bells. Of course.
Relatively certain her aunt wouldn't hear her in her current state, she hadn't stirred in the slightest despite the sound. Mira went to the door and unlocked it, all 3 of the deadbolts, the door lock, and the chain, which seemed like overkill.
She opened the door and stepped inside, just in time for another strike of the bell to meet her. The night was cool, a welcome respite from the stuffiness of the house. She surveyed the neighborhood. Black, anonymous windows stared back at her with suspicion. Her eyes landed on the chapel. A 4th and final bell rang. Mira looked back inside at the grandfather clock. It was only 1:30 a.m., not 4 a.m., and how odd that the bells would sound at night. Strange, Mira thought. It must be broken. Curious, she stepped toward the chapel, down the dark, winding cobblestone path. Her steps echoed into the darkness, alerting whatever lurked out there in the night to her presence. A twig snapped in the bushes nearby. Mira held still for a moment. Her eyes darted back and forth. It felt like something was about to jump out at her at any moment, just waiting, biding its time. By night, these thickets of bushes, along with the wild moss and ivy on the chapel, combined to give a sense of disconnect, a brief sojourn into nature, despite the suburban contrast mere feet away. But nothing jumped out at her. There was nothing dangerous here. No coyotes, no bears. The only night danger here in the middle of Nowheresville, Wisconsin, was the occasional raccoon. She rolled her eyes and resumed her prowling. The chapel door was hefty and made of a fine, aged oak. She grasped the iron handle with both hands and squeezed. With a clank, the door creaked open on its rusted hinges. Something flew out at her. Mira barely ducked out of the way. It was a bat, squealing its way into the night. Apparently the danger here wasn't outside, but in. Unsettled, she considered the gap in the door. Pure darkness within. With newfound trepidation, she poked her head through the gap. Mira towed her way inside, barefoot, moving slowly, allowing her eyes to adjust to the darkness. Narrow, splintered wooden benches lined either side.
A threadbare, industrial, blood-red rug ran the length of the center aisle.
Dulled moonlight shone through the grime-covered stained glass windows. Cobwebs owned the ceiling, dust and dirt the floor. Feces of an unknown origin were clumped about. But there was still majesty here beneath the decay. The chapel in its original state must have been gorgeous, breathtaking, and maybe even a bit gaudy. The prettiest thing in this stale factory town.
Mira took stock.
Her eyes landed on a closet. She peeked inside.
It was lined with pristine cedar and filled with clothes.
Dozens of red ceremonial robes, carefully pressed, hung, and wrapped in plastic. Curious, an oasis of cleanliness in a desert of filth. She pressed the closet shut and walked down the center aisle. The stained glass gloomed down at her. Partially boarded up in a patchwork manner on the outside, the colored panels looked black from in here. She was halfway down the aisle when she heard a hollow thud from beneath her foot. She leveraged up and down. The floor gave way beneath her, whining under the strain of her weight.
Curious, she rolled back the red rug, carefully avoiding a pile of brown mystery poop, to reveal a trap door.
It was ornate, hand-carved and painted a bright red. The wood had not aged, safely protected beneath a thick carpet. Images were etched into the wood, but in the darkness, she couldn't make them out. She knelt down next to the trapdoor and pulled at the handle. It didn't budge. It was locked tight. She frowned, tracing the ornate keyhole with her finger. There was something intriguing about it, something that called to her. Open it. There is truth within. Suddenly, a twinge of light appeared through the keyhole. Mira's eyes widened. There was something beneath the trapdoor. The light grew. Then the edges of the trapdoor itself began to glow. The trapdoor handle started to vibrate. The light inside burned brighter, the handle now rattling and clanking loudly. Her intrigue turned to panic all at once. She jumped to her feet, threw the rug back over the trapdoor, and ran. Mira heaved the chapel door shut and hurried across the lawn, slowing only to catch her breath as she reached the safety of her aunt's front porch. Her mind was racing. What the hell was that? There had to be an explanation. There is light, even in darkness.
Whatever that meant. She brushed the nonsense thought away.
She hated how her brain worked sometimes. Was she asleep and dreaming? Perhaps it was simply a basement workshop. Yeah, that was it. There was no monster or demon or whatever lurking beneath. There was no need to be hysterical. There must be a normal door elsewhere with a normal set of stairs. Someone in the congregation was simply at work down there. Yeah, that was it. The same somebody probably rang the bells too. But she was less than reassured. She opened the front door of the house, about to return inside, when she heard something coming up behind her. She tensed up, pressed herself against the doorframe, prepared to defend herself, sure that whatever was beneath the trapdoor had followed her. As the sound grew closer, it became clear. Mira recognized that sound. Skateboard wheels grinding on pavement. Mira poked her head out. Who was out at this time of night?
On the street, a teenage girl was rolling in and out of streetlights on a skateboard.
She was a young punk. Her clothes were torn, and a permanent air of cynical disdain stuck smugly to her face. She was a striking contrast to the neatly apportioned neighborhood she was riding through. As she glided in and out of the streetlights, her eyes scanned over and met Mira's. Mira stopped breathing.
The skateboarding girl rolled in and out of another light, past Vivian's house, but the door was now shut,
And Mira was gone. The girl did a double take, but kept rolling past. Safely inside, Mira stood pressed against the front door. She peeked through the stained glass as the girl skated away. She didn't know why, but something about the girl had scared her. Intensely. Instinctively. Deep in her soul. She exhaled and took a step toward the stairs to return to her room. Somebody came rushing at her in the darkness, a flash of silver raised high overhead. Mira screamed and backed against the front door, cornered, nowhere to run. Mira? A wayward glint of moonlight revealed Vivian, wielding a knife, having only just stopped herself at the last second, realizing she was about to attack her niece. Mira! What are you doing? What are you doing? Vivian lowered the knife with a shaking hand and pulled Mira into a desperate hug. I thought someone was breaking in. I just went outside. You can't just leave the house like that after dark. There are dangerous people out there. It isn't safe, especially for you. Mira looked at her aunt askew. What does she mean by that? Back to bed, before we have any accidents. Mira headed for the stairs in a daze. When she glanced back, she saw Vivian returning the knife to a decorative oak box on the hallway table. The knife had a golden hilt and seemed to be encrusted with jewels. It gleamed even in the darkness. Vivian set the knife inside carefully with 2 hands. Then she shut the lid, closed her eyes, and began to mutter a prayer. Not wanting to be caught spying, Mira slinked up the stairs to her room and left her aunt to her prayers. Homeschool is brought to you by Wonder Peak Media. Written by Casey Giltner. Homeschool was read by me, Zoe Reed. Produced by Ava Provolo. Edited by Reed Barron. Music by Young Jun Kim. Artwork by Kim Jacobson.